Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from. Something genuinely significant has been building over the past several days, and I want to walk through the entire current state of it today because this is exactly the kind of specific technical breakthrough American negotiators have reportedly been waiting on for weeks. Iran and Oman have now agreed on the actual coordinates for shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz, with both sides describing a broader deal as being on the verge of being finalized. But in genuinely classic fashion for this entire war, that apparent breakthrough is arriving wrapped in layers of continued Iranian resistance, a hardline political shakeup inside Tehran, and a president who's now publicly describing his own approach as, in his words, semi-negotiating. So let's get into the full picture. Let's start with the actual technical achievement, because it's genuinely specific and worth understanding in detail. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, said this past weekend that Iran and Oman are, in his own words, very close to a deal on managing the waterway, with both countries confirming they've agreed on the actual coordinates for shipping routes through the strait. That's a meaningfully concrete step, not a vague diplomatic gesture, but literal, agreed-upon navigational coordinates, the kind of granular technical detail that has to get resolved before any functioning shipping arrangement can actually operate in practice. Oman's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has independently described these negotiations as positive and constructive. And on Friday, the spokesperson for the National Security Commission of Iran's own hardline-dominated parliament confirmed the broader framework of an arrangement with Oman had been agreed upon, with a deal expected soon. According to Kazem Gharibabadi, Iran's deputy foreign minister for legal and international affairs, speaking to Iran's IRNA state news agency, the actual understanding between Tehran and Muscat involves large parts of the shipping route running through Iran's own territorial waters, with some parts passing through Oman's waters instead. That's a genuinely specific, workable arrangement, the kind of detail that tells you real technical negotiators have been sitting down and hashing out exactly how commercial vessels would physically navigate this waterway going forward, rather than just issuing broad political statements about wanting peace. Here's why this specific technical breakthrough connects so directly to what the US has reportedly been waiting for. The proposed broader agreement, which has been under negotiation for several weeks now, is specifically intended to restore the June 17th ceasefire between Washington and Tehran, resolve the underlying disputes over shipping through this exact waterway, and critically, create space for broader negotiations on Iran's nuclear program and the other unresolved issues we've covered extensively throughout this series. Trump himself struck a genuinely optimistic tone just this past Tuesday, telling reporters negotiations with Iran were, in his words, moving along very nicely, adding, "We'll find out," when pressed for more specifics. But here's where the story gets genuinely more complicated, and I think this is honestly the most important part of today's video because the gap between the apparent technical progress and the actual political reality on the ground remains genuinely enormous. Despite all of this coordinate-level agreement and the broadly positive language coming from both Tehran and Muscat, Iran continues to insist, repeatedly and explicitly, that it is negotiating only with Oman, not directly with Washington. Iran maintains that it and Oman should jointly manage the strait according to their respective territorial waters, retaining control over navigation there themselves, rather than this representing any kind of broader capitulation to American demands. And Araghchi has been genuinely blunt about the conditions still attached to any actual reopening. He specifically cautioned that the reopening of the strait remains, in his words, subject to other conditions, including the US making amends for what he described as a violation of the memorandum of understanding both countries had agreed to back in June. According to ABC News reporting, Araghchi went even further, alleging the United States has continued violating that June memorandum, and stating plainly that until that violation, in his words, comes to an end and the United States compensates for what it has violated, the possibility of resuming negotiations does not exist. He also specifically reiterated that an agreement with Oman does not mean the Strait of Hormuz will actually be reopened, a genuinely important clarification given how easily the coordinate agreement news might otherwise be read as signaling imminent, full normalization. Iran has also stated flatly that it will not reopen the strait until the US naval blockade of its own ports is lifted, adding yet another concrete precondition on top of the compensation demand. So you have a genuinely fascinating layered structure here, real, granular technical progress on the specific shipping coordinates themselves, sitting on top of a whole set of broader political conditions that remain completely unresolved, and that Iran's own foreign minister is explicitly, repeatedly emphasizing rather than downplaying. Let's talk about President Trump's own characterization of where things actually stand, because it's genuinely revealing in its own right. Speaking to Axios this past Sunday, Trump said the United States was, in his words, semi-negotiating with Iran, adding, "We are low-keying it." That's a genuinely unusual, candid piece of public messaging from a sitting president regarding an active, high-stakes diplomatic process. Semi-negotiating isn't the kind of confident, decisive language we've seen from this administration at various earlier points throughout this war, and it arrived specifically amid reports from Iranian state media that no formal negotiations were actually underway between the two countries at all. Trump also offered some genuinely important strategic reasoning in that same Axios interview, signaling real patience and suggesting the United States would probably wait for the Islamic Republic's economic pain to soften its stance over time. That connects directly to everything we covered in a recent video regarding Iran's genuinely severe economic collapse, the runaway inflation, the currency crisis, the brain drain, the mounting public discontent we documented in detail. Trump's own framing here suggests the American negotiating strategy at this specific moment isn't built around forcing some immediate dramatic capitulation. It's built around patiently waiting for that accumulated economic pressure to do the work of shifting Iran's negotiating posture over a longer time frame, rather than through any single new dramatic military or diplomatic push. Now let's get to what might be the single most significant political development buried within all of this, because I think it genuinely complicates any simple, optimistic reading of the coordinate agreement news. According to Bloomberg reporting from just this past weekend, Iran promoted a hardline former commander to serve as its top security official, shaking up the composition of its highest decision-making body on national defense. And this reshuffle happened specifically after Iran had already said it was very close to a deal with Oman over the strait. Think about the timing of that decision for a second. At the exact moment Iranian and Omani negotiators were reportedly closing in on a technical breakthrough regarding shipping coordinates, Iran's own leadership was simultaneously elevating a hardline figure into one of the country's most consequential security decision-making roles. That kind of personnel move tells you something genuinely important about the internal political dynamics driving Iran's actual negotiating posture. And it echoes something we discussed at length in a previous video regarding the very real internal power struggle currently playing out inside Iran's government. We've already covered the Assembly of Experts Bureau publicly condemning any diplomatic engagement as an unforgivable betrayal, and the reported tension between hardline factions and President Pezeshkian's own more pragmatic, negotiation-focused approach. This new hardline security appointment fits directly into that same pattern, suggesting that even as technical negotiators make genuine progress on the granular shipping details, the broader internal balance of power inside Iran may actually be shifting toward greater hardline influence over the country's overall strategic direction, rather than toward the kind of accommodation that would make a full, comprehensive deal more likely to actually materialize and hold. There's also a genuinely notable symbolic detail worth mentioning from the same news cycle. Iranian state media shared an undated video of Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, the first such video released since his formal appointment back in March, following the assassination of his father, Ali Khamenei, at the very start of this war. We've discussed throughout this series just how murky and unsettled Iran's own leadership situation has remained, with genuine, persistent uncertainty about who's actually calling the shots at the top of the government. The fact that this specific video release is being treated as newsworthy, the first public appearance of sorts from Iran's own nominal supreme leader in months, tells you just how opaque that leadership situation has continued to be, even as the country simultaneously navigates this genuinely consequential diplomatic moment regarding Hormuz. Let's talk about the actual physical shipping situation on the ground right now, too, because the numbers here genuinely illustrate the gap between diplomatic optimism and current reality. Traffic in both the Bab el-Mandeb and Hormuz Straits was down to just a handful of vessels earlier this past week amid the latest round of escalations, though it has relatively rebounded since, while still remaining far below unobstructed pre-war levels. And in a detail we've actually touched on in previous videos, some ships have resorted to turning off their transponders entirely to avoid being detected while attempting these transits, which tells you the underlying risk environment remains genuinely serious even amid all this positive diplomatic language. Global energy markets have responded to the increasing prospects of a diplomatic agreement, with Brent crude standing at around $83 a barrel at Friday's close. A meaningful but hardly dramatic market reaction, given how significant a full, comprehensive resolution to this standoff would actually represent for global oil supply. And just to underscore, once again, how far this situation remains from fully settled, tensions have continued spiking in and around the strait, even as this diplomatic push has unfolded. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Agency reported a cargo ship struck by an unidentified projectile off Oman just this past Tuesday, happening in the exact same news cycle as Trump's optimistic comments about negotiations moving along nicely. That's genuinely become one of the defining, almost jarring patterns of this entire war that we've documented across multiple videos now. Real diplomatic movement running in direct parallel with continued live physical risk to commercial shipping in the exact same waters being discussed at the negotiating table. Let's connect all of this back to the broader arc of ceasefire attempts we've traced throughout this entire series, because I think that history is essential for calibrating how much weight to actually put on this latest round of progress. Back in April, we documented Iran agreeing to a 2-week ceasefire specifically tied to reopening the Strait of Hormuz, with Araghchi confirming at the time that safe passage would become possible through direct coordination with Iran's armed forces, and Trump declaring the U.S. had already achieved its military objectives and was very close to a definitive long-term peace agreement. That specific ceasefire, as we've covered extensively, eventually broke down. Then came the June 17th Memorandum of Understanding, which briefly restored something much closer to normal shipping conditions before that agreement also collapsed in mid-July following renewed attacks on commercial vessels. So, this latest round of coordinate-level agreement between Iran and Oman represents genuinely the third or fourth distinct attempt throughout this war to restore some kind of functioning arrangement around the strait. And I think that pattern itself deserves real, explicit acknowledgement rather than treating this newest development as somehow fundamentally different in kind from what's come before. What does feel genuinely different this time, though, is the specific framing from Iran's own foreign minister, explicitly stating that even a completed Oman agreement wouldn't automatically mean the strait reopens, and explicitly tying any actual reopening to a list of additional demands: American compensation for the alleged June memorandum violation, and a lifted naval blockade. That's a considerably more hedged, conditional framing than what we saw back in April, when Iran's language suggested a more direct, immediate path from ceasefire agreement to actual reopened shipping. I think that hedging genuinely matters, and it connects to something we discussed in detail in our video about Iran's internal economic collapse and the surrounding political resistance to any diplomatic accommodation. Given everything we now know about the hardline pushback happening inside Iran's own government, the Assembly of Experts' condemnation, this new hardline security appointment, and the broader internal power struggle between Pezeshkian's more pragmatic approach and the hardline clerical establishment, it makes considerable sense that Iran's actual public negotiating position would come wrapped in exactly this kind of layered, conditional language. Araghchi and Garibabadi can point to genuine, real technical progress on the specific shipping coordinates to satisfy whatever domestic political pressure exists for demonstrating diplomatic engagement is producing results, while simultaneously attaching enough additional conditions and caveats to protect against exactly the accusation of capitulation that we've seen hardline factions inside Iran leveling at the broader negotiating process. So, let's bring this all together and think honestly about what Iran actually did here, and whether it genuinely represents something the U.S. has been waiting for, in any meaningful sense. I think the honest answer is genuinely yes. On the narrow, specific question of technical shipping coordination, Iran agreeing to actual, specific navigational coordinates with Oman represents real, concrete progress, the kind of granular, unglamorous groundwork that has to happen before any broader ceasefire framework could realistically function in practice. That's meaningfully different from the pattern of vague, high-level statements about wanting peace that we've documented repeatedly throughout this war, statements that historically collapsed within days or weeks once the underlying details proved harder to resolve than initial optimistic announcements suggested. But the broader claim implicit in a headline like the one we're covering today, that this represents some kind of clean, decisive turning point in the war, doesn't really hold up against everything else happening in this exact same news cycle. Iran's continued explicit insistence that it isn't negotiating directly with the U.S. at all. The specific hard conditions still attached to any actual reopening, compensation demands, and the lifted blockade, a hardline security appointment happening at precisely the moment diplomatic progress was being announced. Trump's own candid characterization of the process as semi-negotiating and low-keying it. Continued attacks on commercial shipping happening in real time in the exact same waters under discussion. And a supreme leader whose public presence remains so genuinely minimal that a single undated video clip counts as significant news. I think that's honestly the most accurate, balanced way to understand this specific moment. Iran did finally do something the U.S. has apparently been waiting for, reaching genuine, granular technical agreement on shipping coordinates with Oman that reportedly represents real progress toward restoring the broader ceasefire framework. But everything else happening in parallel, the hardline political shifts inside Iran, the layered conditions still attached to any actual reopening, and the continued live risk to shipping in these exact waters, tells you this remains a genuinely fragile, multi-layered situation, nowhere near the kind of clean, comprehensive resolution that a title promising decisive change might otherwise suggest. Given the full track record we've now documented across this entire series, the failed April ceasefire, the collapsed June memorandum, and now this latest coordinate-level progress arriving wrapped in fresh hardline resistance and conditional Iranian language, I think the honest, appropriately calibrated expectation has to be genuine, real acknowledgement that meaningful technical diplomatic work is clearly still happening even amid repeated setbacks. paired with a clear-eyed recognition that Iran's own internal political dynamics and the specific hard conditions Tehran keeps attaching to any actual reopening mean this specific breakthrough likely represents another meaningful step within an ongoing difficult process, rather than the kind of singular moment that finally, decisively resolves this now more than 5-month-old war. That's going to do it for this one. Let me know what you think, whether you see this Hormuz shipping coordinate agreement as a genuine sign this war is finally moving toward resolution, or whether you think Iran's continued hard conditions and this new hardline security appointment show the underlying conflict remains just as unresolved as it's been for months. Drop your thoughts down in the comments. I always read them and genuinely enjoy seeing where everybody's head is at on this. If you want to stay on top of the day-to-day developments in this conflict, go ahead and follow along on our social channels as well, especially given how quickly this specific story has been shifting over just the past several days. And if this is the kind of coverage you want to see more of, go check out the next video. It should be popping up right about now. Appreciate you watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.